They thought they'd found the perfect victim, a quiet, skinny transfer student who never fought back. So when Tyler Brooks and his crew cornered him in that bathroom and forced him to his knees with a scrub brush, they had no idea they were about to discover just how wrong they were. What happened next would leave the entire school speechless, and Tyler would never be the same again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Johnson had learned the art of being invisible long before he ever stepped foot in Riverside High School. As he walked through the unfamiliar hallways of his new school in Millbrook, Oregon, he kept his head down and his shoulders slightly hunched, a posture he'd perfected over years of moving from place to place. His father's job in software engineering had taken their family across 3 states in the past 5 years, and Marcus had become an expert at reading the social landscape of a new school within the first few days. The morning sun streamed through the large windows of Riverside High as Marcus made his way to his locker, number 247, tucked away in a quieter section of the building. He'd specifically requested a locker away from the main traffic areas, hoping to avoid the kind of attention that had gotten him into trouble at his previous school. His mother had made him promise, with tears in her eyes, that he would keep his head down and focus on his studies. No more incidents, no more phone calls from principals. Just blend in, graduate, and move on to college where he could finally start fresh. The hallways buzzed with the typical energy of a Thursday morning. Students clustered around lockers, comparing homework answers and discussing weekend plans. Marcus observed them all with the analytical eye he'd developed over the years. There were the theater kids, easily identified by their dramatic gestures and vintage band t-shirts. The academic achievers huddled near the library entrance, their arms loaded with textbooks and color-coded notebooks. And then there were the athletes, who seemed to own the central corridors of the school with their Letterman jackets and confident strides. Marcus had been at Riverside for exactly 12 days, and he'd managed to maintain his invisibility perfectly. He sat in the back of every classroom, spoke only when directly questioned by teachers, and ate his lunch alone in the library while reading novels he'd borrowed from the public library downtown. His grades were excellent, as always, but he made sure never to be the top performer in any class. Being too smart drew attention, and attention was the last thing Marcus Johnson wanted. His first period was American history with Mrs. Walsh, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who seemed to genuinely care about her students' learning. Marcus had chosen a seat in the 3rd row from the back, close enough to hear everything clearly, but far enough to avoid being called upon frequently. As he settled into his desk and opened his notebook, he felt the familiar sense of cautious optimism that maybe, just maybe, this school would be different. The classroom filled with students. As the bell approached, and Marcus kept his eyes focused on organizing his materials, he'd learned that making eye contact too early in his time at a new school could be interpreted as either a challenge or an invitation for friendship, neither of which he was prepared to handle. Instead, he concentrated on arranging his pens in order of color and reviewing his notes from the previous day's lesson about the Industrial Revolution. It was during this quiet moment of preparation that Marcus first became aware of Tyler Brooks. He didn't see him enter the classroom, but he felt the shift in energy that accompanied certain people wherever they went. Conversations became slightly louder, laughter more forced, and there was an underlying tension that seemed to electrify the air. Marcus had encountered students like this before, and he knew without looking up that someone with significant social power had just walked into the room. Tyler Brooks was 17 years old and built like the wrestler he was, with broad shoulders and the kind of confident bearing that came from never having to question his place in the social hierarchy. His blonde hair was perfectly styled, and his clothes were expensive without being flashy. He wore his Letterman jacket like armor, and when he spoke, other students listened. As the son of Coach Brooks, the head of Riverside High's athletic department, and with a mother who served on the school board, Tyler had grown up understanding that rules were for other people. Marcus felt Tyler's presence rather than saw it, keeping his head down as the larger boy made his way to a seat in the center of the classroom. There was something about the way other students shifted to accommodate him, the small gestures of deference that spoke volumes about the power dynamics Marcus was trying so hard to avoid. He'd seen it all before at Lincoln Academy in Portland, at Jefferson High in Seattle, and at Mountain View in Denver. There was always someone like Tyler Brooks, and Marcus had learned that the best strategy was to stay completely off their radar. Mrs. Walsh began the lesson with a discussion about labor unions and workers' rights, and Marcus found himself genuinely interested in the topic. His hand almost moved to volunteer an answer when she asked about the significance of the Pullman strike, but he caught himself and kept his thoughts to himself. He'd done extensive reading on the subject during one of his family's previous moves, but sharing that knowledge would only draw attention to his academic abilities. As the class progressed, Marcus became aware that he was being watched. It was a subtle sensation at first, like an itch between his shoulder blades, but gradually became more noticeable. During a break in Mrs. Walsh's lecture, when students were supposed to be reading a passage from their textbooks, Marcus risked a quick glance around the room. His eyes met Tyler's for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The wrestler was studying him with the kind of calculating interest that predators showed when sizing up potential prey. Marcus immediately looked away and focused intently on his textbook, but the damage was done. He'd been noticed, cataloged, and filed away in Tyler's mental database of students who might be worth his attention. For the rest of the class period, Marcus could feel those eyes on him intermittently. And when the bell rang, he made sure to pack up his materials slowly, allowing the classroom to empty before he made his exit. The hallway was crowded with students changing classes, and Marcus used the chaos to blend into the flow of traffic. He had chemistry next in a building across campus, and he'd learned to time his movements to avoid the areas where the athletic students typically congregated. As he walked, he mentally reviewed his schedule for the day, calculating the safest routes between his classes and identifying potential problem areas where he might be cornered. Chemistry passed without incident, as did his third period English class, where they were reading To Kill a Mockingbird and discussing themes of justice and moral courage. Marcus found the irony of the topic somewhat bitter, given his own tendency to avoid confrontation at all costs. He understood the message Harper Lee was trying to convey, but in the real world, standing up for what was right often led to consequences that extended far beyond the person doing the standing. It was during lunch that Marcus first encountered Tyler Brooks directly. He'd been sitting alone at a table near the library entrance, as had become his routine, when a shadow fell across his book. Marcus looked up to find Tyler standing beside his table, flanked by two other students. One was Jake Morrison, a linebacker on the football team, whose reputation for both athletic ability and casual cruelty was already known to Marcus. The other was Connor Hayes, who seemed to serve as Tyler's personal enforcer for situations that required more physical persuasion. Tyler's smile was friendly enough to fool a casual observer, but Marcus had learned to read the subtle signs of aggression that adults often missed. The way Tyler's eyes didn't quite match his expression, the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested barely controlled energy, and the manner in which his companions positioned themselves to block potential escape routes, all told Marcus that this was not a social visit. "Hey there, new guy," Tyler said, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by nearby tables, but not loud enough to attract adult attention. "I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Tyler Brooks." He gestured to his companions. "This is Jake and Connor. We like to make sure all the new students feel welcome at Riverside." Marcus closed his book carefully and looked up at Tyler, making sure to keep his expression neutral and non-threatening. "I'm Marcus Johnson," he replied quietly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thanks for the welcome, but I'm doing fine on my own. Tyler's smile widened, but there was something predatory about it now. Oh, but that's the thing about Riverside, Marcus. Nobody's really on their own here. We're all part of one big community. And communities have certain expectations, certain ways of doing things. He paused, letting his words sink in. I'm sure a smart guy like you understands what I mean. Marcus understood perfectly. This was the recruitment speech, the initial approach that would either result in his acceptance into Tyler's sphere of influence or mark him as a target for future harassment. He'd heard variations of it at every school he'd attended, delivered by different students, but always carrying the same underlying message: submit or suffer. I appreciate the offer, Marcus said carefully, but I prefer to keep a low profile. I'm not really interested in getting involved in school politics or social groups. I just want to focus on my classes and graduate. Tyler exchanged a look with Jake and Connor, and Marcus saw something shift in the wrestler's expression. The false friendliness dropped away, replaced by a cooler calculation. That's unfortunate, Marcus. See, at Riverside, we believe in school spirit, participation, being part of something bigger than yourself. He leaned forward slightly, bringing his face closer to Marcus's eye level. Students who try to stay separate, who think they're too good for the rest of us, well, they sometimes find that their time here becomes very uncomfortable. The threat was clear, and Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest that accompanied these moments of decision. He could feel the other students in the cafeteria watching now, sensing drama in the way that teenagers always did. Some looked sympathetic, others excited by the possibility of conflict, but none showed any inclination to intervene. Marcus was on his own, just as he always was. I'm not trying to be separate, Marcus said, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. I just prefer to keep to myself. I'm not trying to cause any problems for anyone. Tyler straightened up, his smile returning, but with a sharp edge now. Good to hear, Marcus, really good to hear. Because problems are exactly what we try to avoid here at Riverside. He picked up Marcus's book, examining the cover with exaggerated interest. To Kill a Mockingbird. Classic choice. Lots of important lessons in there about standing up for what's right, wouldn't you say? Marcus said nothing, recognizing the manipulation for what it was. Tyler was testing him, looking for reactions that would give away his thoughts or intentions. It was a game that Marcus had learned to play well, even though he hated every moment of it. Well, Tyler continued, setting the book back down with deliberate care, I'll let you get back to your reading. But Marcus, remember what I said about community, about participation. I have a feeling we'll be seeing more of each other soon. He turned to leave, then paused as if remembering something. Oh, and Marcus, next time we talk, I hope you'll be a little more enthusiastic about the opportunities Riverside has to offer. As Tyler and his companions walked away, Marcus felt the familiar mixture of relief and dread that followed these encounters. He'd managed to avoid immediate confrontation, but he knew that this was just the beginning. Tyler Brooks had marked him as a target, and from experience, Marcus knew that meant his peaceful existence at Riverside High was about to come to an end. For the rest of the lunch period, Marcus tried to focus on his book, but the words seemed to blur together on the page. He found himself thinking about his previous school, Lincoln Academy, and the incident that had led to his family's hasty departure from Portland. He'd promised his parents that he would never let his training take control again, that he would find other ways to handle conflict. But as he sat in that cafeteria, feeling the weight of hostile attention from across the room, Marcus began to wonder if some promises were impossible to keep. The afternoon classes passed in a haze of anxiety and anticipation. Marcus found it Difficult to concentrate on lectures about chemical equations and European history when part of his mind was constantly scanning for threats. He'd developed hypervigilance as a survival mechanism over the years, and now it was working overtime. Every footstep in the hallway, every burst of laughter, every slammed locker door made him tense up, expecting confrontation. When the final bell rang, Marcus carefully gathered his materials and planned his exit strategy. He would take the long route to his locker, avoiding the main corridors where Tyler and his friends were likely to congregate. Then he would collect his homework assignments and head straight home, where he could at least pretend that everything was normal for a few more hours. But as Marcus stepped out of his last class of the day, he realized that Tyler Brooks had other plans. The wrestler was waiting in the hallway, leaning against a bank of lockers with his arms crossed, and when he saw Marcus, he pushed off the wall and began walking in his direction. Jake and Connor were nowhere to be seen, which somehow made the situation feel more ominous rather than less. "Marcus," Tyler called out, his voice carrying a false warmth that didn't fool anyone within earshot. Perfect timing. "I was just thinking about our conversation at lunch, and I realized I might not have been clear about something important." Marcus considered his options quickly. The hallway was crowded with students heading to after-school activities or their rides home, but he knew from experience that witnesses didn't necessarily mean safety. If anything, an audience might encourage Tyler to escalate the situation for the sake of maintaining his reputation. "What can I help you with, Tyler?" Marcus asked, stopping but maintaining what he hoped was a safe distance. Tyler's smile was sharp as a blade. "Well, it occurred to me that you might not fully understand how things work here at Riverside. See, when someone like me takes the time to personally welcome a new student, to offer them opportunities to get involved and feel included, that's not really something you turn down. It's considered rude. Disrespectful even." Marcus felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his expression calm. "I didn't mean to be disrespectful. I just prefer to keep to yourself," Tyler interrupted. "Yeah, you mentioned that, but here's the thing, Marcus. In a school like this, in a community like Millbrook, we don't really have the luxury of people keeping to themselves. We all have to do our part. We all have to contribute." His eyes hardened. "And sometimes that means new students need to be taught exactly what their contribution should be." The hallway around them was beginning to empty as students made their way to their destinations, and Marcus realized that Tyler had timed this confrontation perfectly. Soon they would be relatively alone, with minimal adult supervision and few witnesses to whatever Tyler had planned. "I think there might be a misunderstanding," Marcus said carefully. "I'm happy to contribute to the school community. I just wasn't sure what you had in mind." Tyler's smile returned, but it was the kind of expression that made Marcus's skin crawl. "Oh, I have some very specific ideas about how you can contribute, Marcus. In fact, I think it's time we showed you exactly what we expect from new students who want to fit in at Riverside High." As Tyler spoke, Marcus noticed Jake and Connor emerging from different corridors, positioning themselves strategically to cut off potential escape routes. This wasn't a spontaneous confrontation, he realized. It was a planned operation, carefully orchestrated to trap him in a situation where he would have no choice but to submit to whatever humiliation Tyler had in mind. The wrestler stepped closer, and Marcus caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with the lingering smell of the wrestling mats. Tyler was bigger than him by at least 30 pounds and several inches, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never lost a physical confrontation. But what Tyler didn't know, what none of them knew, was that size and confidence weren't always enough. "So here's what's going to happen, Marcus," Tyler said, his voice dropping to a level that wouldn't carry to any remaining students in the hallway. "You're going to come with us to somewhere we can have a more private conversation about your attitude. Somewhere we can help you understand exactly what it means to be part of the Riverside community." Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. That preceded violence, and for a moment, his carefully maintained control wavered. His hands wanted to form fists, his muscles wanted to coil and spring, and every instinct he developed over years of training screamed at him to strike first and ask questions later. But then he remembered his mother's tears, his father's disappointed expression, and the promise he'd made to never let his training control his actions again. "Okay," Marcus said quietly, the word tasting like ashes in his mouth. "What do you want me to do?" Tyler's smile widened at Marcus's compliance, mistaking submission for weakness. He gestured toward a side corridor that led away from the main flow of student traffic, and Marcus found himself walking in that direction with Jake and Connor flanking him like escorts to an execution. The hallway they entered was one of the older sections of Riverside High, where the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently and the linoleum floor showed decades of wear from countless student footsteps. As they walked, Marcus's mind raced through possibilities and calculations. He could break away now, make a run for the main office, or try to find a teacher, but that would only delay the inevitable. Tyler had clearly decided that Marcus needed to be put in his place, and running would only make the eventual confrontation worse. Better to see what Tyler had planned and look for an opportunity to defuse the situation without violence. The bathroom they approached was tucked away near the old gymnasium, a facility that had been built in the 1970s and showed its age in every cracked tile and rusted fixture. It was the kind of place that students avoided unless absolutely necessary, and Marcus realized that Tyler had chosen it specifically for its isolation. No teachers patrolled this area regularly, and the few students who might pass by would be unlikely to intervene in whatever was about to happen. Connor pushed open the heavy door, and the smell hit Marcus immediately. It was a combination of industrial disinfectant, mold, and something far worse that made his stomach turn. The bathroom hadn't been properly cleaned in days, maybe weeks. And it showed. Graffiti covered the walls in layers, creating a palimpsest of teenage rebellion and crude humor. Several of the stall doors hung at odd angles, their hinges broken or missing entirely. The floor was a patchwork of cracked tiles and suspicious stains that Marcus didn't want to identify. Tyler entered behind him, followed by Jake, who immediately positioned himself near the door like a sentry. The wrestler surveyed the grimy space with satisfaction, as if he were a general reviewing a battlefield that he'd chosen for its strategic advantages. Marcus stood in the center of the room, every muscle in his body coiled with tension despite his outward appearance of calm resignation. "Welcome to your orientation, Marcus," Tyler said, his voice echoing off the tile walls. "See, at Riverside High we have certain traditions for new students, especially new students who seem to think they're too good for the rest of us." He walked over to one of the sinks where a collection of cleaning supplies had been abandoned by the janitorial staff. Marcus noticed a bucket filled with brown water, a mop with frayed strings, and several bottles of harsh chemicals that made his eyes water from across the room. Connor pulled out his phone and began recording, positioning himself to capture whatever humiliation Tyler had planned. Marcus had seen this pattern before at other schools, the combination of physical intimidation and social media documentation that modern bullies use to maximize their victims' suffering. The video would be shared, uploaded, and used as leverage to ensure continued compliance. "You see, Marcus," Tyler continued, picking up a scrub brush that looked like it had been used to clean far more than just bathroom surfaces. "Every new student needs to prove that they understand their place in the school hierarchy, that they're willing to do whatever it takes to earn their spot in our community." He held up the brush, examining it with mock seriousness. "And sometimes, that means starting at the bottom, literally." Marcus felt his jaw clench involuntarily, but he forced himself to remain still. He could sense where this was heading, and every instinct screamed at him to act before Tyler could escalate further. But he remembered his father's words about the consequences of violence, about how one moment of lost control could destroy everything they'd built as a family. He thought about his mother's fear, her constant worry that her son's training would lead him down a dark path. Tyler knelt down and placed the scrub brush on the filthy floor, then looked up at Marcus with an expression of false sympathy. "I'm afraid this bathroom hasn't been properly cleaned in quite some time. The janitorial staff here is, shall we say, less than thorough in their duties. But that's okay, because we have a volunteer who's going to help us solve that problem." He stood up slowly, savoring the moment. "Isn't that right, Marcus?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus knew that his answer would determine how far Tyler was willing to push this situation. He could feel Jake's presence near the door, blocking any hope of escape, and Connor's phone camera, capturing every moment for posterity. This wasn't just about humiliation. It was about establishing dominance, about creating a precedent that would follow Marcus for the rest of his time at Riverside High. "I don't think this is necessary," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "If you want me to understand how things work here, I'm listening. But this isn't going to accomplish anything productive." Tyler laughed, and the sound bounced off the bathroom walls like the cackle of a hyena. "Oh, but Marcus, you're wrong. This is going to accomplish exactly what I want it to accomplish. You see, respect isn't something you can just explain to someone. It's something they have to earn through experience, through understanding what happens when they don't show proper appreciation for the social order." Jake shifted near the door, and Marcus caught a glimpse of movement in the hallway beyond. For a moment, he hoped that a teacher might pass by, that some adult authority figure would intervene and put an end to this before it escalated further. But the corridor remained empty, and Marcus realized that Tyler had planned this timing carefully. They were alone, isolated, and completely at the mercy of whatever sick game the wrestler wanted to play. Tyler walked over to the nearest toilet stall, where the porcelain bowl was stained with rust and worse. He gestured toward it like a game show host revealing a prize. "Your assignment, Marcus, is simple. You're going to clean this bathroom. All of it. Every surface, every fixture, every square inch of floor. And you're going to do it the old-fashioned way, on your hands and knees with these brushes and rags that our maintenance staff so thoughtfully left behind." Marcus stared at the decrepit facilities, his mind calculating angles and distances, entry points and escape routes. He could take Tyler down in seconds. A quick strike to the solar plexus, followed by a leg sweep that would send the wrestler crashing into the sink. Jake would be harder, bigger, and stronger, but Marcus had been trained to fight multiple opponents. Connor would drop his phone and run the moment violence erupted. But then what? Word would spread throughout the school. His parents would be called, and his carefully constructed new life would crumble just like all the others. "And if I refuse?" Marcus asked, already knowing the answer but hoping to buy time while he considered his options. Tyler's smile turned predatory. "Well, that would be unfortunate. You see, Connor here has been recording our entire conversation. If you refuse to participate in this simple community service project, well, I'm afraid we'll have to share this video with the entire school. Everyone will see how the new kid thought he was too good to help clean up our facilities. How he showed disrespect to students who were just trying to help him fit in." Connor waved his phone, confirming that the camera was indeed rolling. Marcus could see the red recording light, and he knew that Tyler had planned this entire scenario to ensure maximum leverage. Whether he complied or refused, he would be at Tyler's mercy. The wrestler had created a no-win situation, and he was clearly enjoying every moment of Marcus's discomfort. "Of course," Tyler continued, "if you do participate, if you show that proper attitude and really put your back into it, well, then this video becomes our little secret. A private moment between friends, you might say. Nobody else has to know about your first day of community service at Riverside High." Marcus looked around the disgusting bathroom one more time, taking in the full scope of what Tyler was demanding. The wrestler wanted him to scrub toilets that hadn't been properly maintained in months, to crawl across floors covered in substances that made his skin crawl just thinking about them. It was designed to be maximally humiliating, to break his spirit and establish Tyler's dominance for everyone to see. But as Marcus stared at the filthy surfaces, something else began to build inside him alongside the rage. It was a cold, calculating fury that his martial arts instructors had taught him to recognize and control. The kind of anger that could be channeled into precise, devastating action if properly directed. Tyler thought he was dealing with a typical high school student, someone who could be intimidated and broken through crude displays of power. He had no idea that he was pushing someone who had been trained since childhood to remain calm under pressure, to assess threats accurately, and to respond with overwhelming force when necessary. Marcus took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it." Tyler clapped his hands together in mock applause. "Excellent choice, Marcus. I knew you were smarter than you looked. Now why don't you start with that toilet over there? Really get in close and make sure you don't miss any spots. Connor's going to document your technique so we can provide feedback if needed." As Marcus walked toward the designated stall, he felt something shift inside him. The careful control he'd maintained for months began to crack, and underneath it was something far more dangerous than Tyler could possibly imagine. His instructors had always warned him about this moment, the point where discipline gave way to instinct, where years of training took over from conscious thought. They'd called it the edge, and they'd spent countless hours teaching him to recognize its approach and pull back before crossing the line. But as Marcus knelt down beside that disgusting toilet, as he felt Tyler's eyes on his back and heard Connor's snickering behind the phone camera, he realized that some lines were meant to be crossed. Some boundaries existed only to be shattered when the situation demanded it. And Tyler Brooks was about to learn exactly what happened when you pushed the wrong person too far. Marcus picked up the scrub brush with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from anger or anticipation, he couldn't tell. Tyler was still talking, outlining exactly how he wanted the cleaning to be performed, but his words seemed to fade into background noise. All Marcus could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat, steady and strong, and the whisper of his grandfather's voice from years ago. "Sometimes, boy, the only way to stop a bully is to show them what real strength looks like." The brush felt strange in his hands, foreign and wrong compared to the weapons he'd trained with over the years. But Marcus had learned to improvise, to turn any object into a tool for defense or offense when the situation required it. He began to scrub mechanically, his movements precise and controlled, while his mind raced through possibilities and strategies. Tyler stepped closer, emboldened by Marcus's apparent compliance. "That's it, Marcus. Really put some effort into it. Make sure you get all the way down into the bowl there. We want this to be absolutely spotless when you're finished." His voice carried a note of sadistic pleasure that made Marcus's skin crawl. Connor moved around to get a better angle with his camera, documenting every moment of what he thought was complete humiliation. "This is perfect," he whispered to Tyler. "Wait until everyone sees this. The new kid's going to be known as the toilet scrubber for the rest of high school." Jake remained by the door, occasionally glancing out into the hallway to make sure they weren't being observed. His role was clear. He was there to prevent escape and handle any potential interference from teachers or other students. But his position also meant that he was slightly separated from Tyler and Connor, a detail that Marcus filed away for future reference. As Marcus continued his degrading task, Tyler's confidence grew. The wrestler began to pace around the small bathroom like a drill sergeant inspecting troops, offering commentary on Marcus's technique and demanding that he work faster, harder, more thoroughly. With each passing minute, Tyler's voice became more aggressive, his demands more unreasonable. "You missed a spot there, Marcus," Tyler said. pointing to a section of the toilet rim that was already cleaner than it had been in months. And over there too. I'm starting to think you're not taking this seriously. Maybe you need some additional motivation. Marcus paused in his scrubbing and looked up at Tyler, and for just a moment, the wrestler caught a glimpse of something in those dark eyes that made him take an involuntary step backward. It was like looking into the eyes of a predator, something wild and dangerous that had been carefully caged, but was now testing the strength of its bars. But the moment passed quickly, and Marcus lowered his gaze back to his work. Tyler shook off the momentary unease and stepped forward again, his confidence returning. He was in control here, he reminded himself. He was the one with the power, the one setting the terms. Marcus was just another scared new kid who would do whatever it took to avoid further humiliation. Actually, Tyler said, his voice taking on a new note of malicious inspiration, I don't think the brush is really getting the job done properly. This toilet needs a more thorough cleaning than that. He paused for effect, savoring the anticipation. I think you need to get in there with your hands, Marcus. Really make sure every surface is spotless. Marcus's hands stilled on the brush handle, and once again Tyler caught that flash of something dangerous in his eyes. But this time, instead of backing away, the wrestler leaned closer, feeding off what he interpreted as fear and desperation. That's right, Marcus, Tyler continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that Connor's phone could barely pick up. Hands and knees, just like I said. Show us how dedicated you are to earning your place at Riverside High. Show us what you're really made of. The bathroom fell silent except for the distant drip of a leaky faucet and the sound of Connor's excited breathing behind his camera. Jake shifted restlessly by the door, perhaps sensing that something was about to change, but not understanding what. And in that moment of perfect stillness, Marcus Johnson made his decision. He set down the scrub brush carefully and turned to face Tyler directly. When he spoke, his voice was calm and steady, but there was something underneath it that made all three of his tormentors suddenly pay very close attention. No, Marcus said simply. Tyler blinked as if he hadn't heard correctly. Excuse me? Marcus stood up slowly, his movements fluid and controlled. I said no, Tyler. I'm not going to put my hands in that toilet. I'm not going to crawl around on this floor for your entertainment. And I'm not going to pretend that any of this is acceptable behavior. For a moment, Tyler seemed genuinely confused. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. New students were supposed to break under pressure, to accept their place in the social hierarchy and comply with whatever demands were made of them. They weren't supposed to refuse, especially not when they were cornered and outnumbered 3-1. I don't think you understand the situation here, Marcus, Tyler said, his voice rising slightly. You don't get to say no. You don't get to have an opinion about what's acceptable. You're going to do exactly what I tell you to do, or things are going to get much worse for you. Marcus stood perfectly still, his hands loose at his sides, his breathing steady and controlled. To someone who didn't know what to look for, he might have appeared calm, even passive. But Tyler was beginning to sense that something fundamental had changed in the dynamic of their confrontation. See, that's where you're wrong, Marcus replied, his voice still eerily calm. I do get to say no. I do get to have an opinion about what's acceptable. And most importantly, I get to decide how I respond when someone tries to humiliate me. Tyler's face began to flush red with anger and embarrassment. This wasn't going according to plan, and he could feel his carefully constructed authority beginning to slip away. Connor was still recording, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming Tyler's loss of control rather than Marcus's submission. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Tyler snarled, stepping closer and using his size advantage to try to intimidate Marcus back into compliance. My father runs the athletic department at this school. My mother is on the school board. I can make your life here absolutely miserable, and nobody will lift a finger to stop me. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if considering Tyler's words seriously. You know what, Tyler? You're probably right about all of that. I'm sure you do. Have a lot of influence here. I'm sure you could make things difficult for me. He paused, and when he continued, there was something new in his voice, a quiet confidence that made Tyler's threat seem suddenly less intimidating. But here's what you don't understand. I've been dealing with people like you my entire life. I've moved from school to school, town to town, and there's always someone like you waiting. Someone who thinks that power means the right to humiliate others. Tyler's hands clenched into fists, and Marcus noted the movement with professional interest. The wrestler was losing control, moving from psychological intimidation toward physical violence. It was a predictable escalation, one that Marcus had seen countless times before. And here's the other thing you don't understand, Marcus continued, his voice never rising above conversational level. Every time I've encountered someone like you, I've made the same mistake. I've tried to avoid confrontation. I've tried to keep my head down and wait for the problem to go away. But it never does it, Tyler? Bullies don't stop until someone makes them stop. Tyler was breathing harder now, his face red with fury and confusion. This quiet new kid was supposed to be easy prey, someone who could be broken and controlled without significant effort. But instead of cowering, Marcus seemed to be growing more confident with each passing second. So here's what's going to happen, Marcus said, and suddenly his stance shifted almost imperceptibly. To an untrained observer, he might have looked the same as before, but Tyler's wrestling instincts picked up on the change immediately. There was something different about the way Marcus was positioned now, something that suggested he was no longer just standing there passively. You're going to take your friends, and you're going to walk out of this bathroom. You're going to delete that video Connor's been recording, and you're going to find someone else to pick on. Because if you don't, if you push this any further, you're going to discover exactly why my family had to leave our last 3 towns so suddenly. The threat hung in the air like a thunderclap, and for the first time since this confrontation began, Tyler felt genuinely uncertain about what might happen next. There was something in Marcus's tone, in his posture, in the way he seemed to have shed his earlier submissiveness like a snake shedding its skin, that suggested this wasn't just empty bravado. But Tyler had built his reputation on never backing down, never showing weakness in front of others. Too many people were watching now. Connor with his camera, Jake by the door, and potentially other students who might hear about this confrontation later. He couldn't afford to let some scrawny new kid challenge his authority and walk away unscathed. Is that supposed to scare me? Tyler asked, stepping forward until he was only inches away from Marcus. Some story about your mysterious past? Let me tell you something, Marcus. I don't care where you came from or what happened at your other schools. This is Riverside High, and here, I'm the one who decides what happens to kids like you. Marcus looked up at Tyler, and this time he didn't bother to hide the coldness in his eyes. Kids like me, he repeated softly. You have no idea what kind of kid I am, Tyler, but you're about to find out. Tyler raised his hand, whether to shove Marcus or grab him by the shirt, but he never got the chance to complete the motion. Because in that instant, Marcus Johnson stopped being the quiet, submissive new student and became something else entirely. Something that Tyler Brooks was completely unprepared to handle. The transformation was so sudden and complete that Tyler barely had time to register what was happening before. Marcus's hand shot out and caught his wrist in a grip that felt like it might snap bones. Tyler tried to pull away, but found that he couldn't move his arm at all. It was as if Marcus's fingers were made of steel, locking his wrist in place with casual, effortless strength. I tried to warn you, Marcus said quietly, and Tyler heard something in his voice that made his blood run cold. I tried to give you a chance to walk away. But you just couldn't help yourself, could you? You just had to push a little further. Take it a little too far. Connor's phone clattered to the floor as he stumbled backward, suddenly realizing that he was witnessing something far more dangerous than a simple bullying incident. Jake started forward from his position by the door, but stopped when Marcus turned his head and looked at him directly. There was something in that gaze that communicated a very clear message: approach at your own risk. Tyler tried again to free his wrist, putting his full strength behind the effort, but Marcus's grip remained unbreakable. Worse than that, he could feel pressure being applied to specific points that sent shooting pains up his arm and made his fingers go numb. This wasn't just strength. This was technique, precision, the kind of knowledge that came from years of training. "What the hell are you?" Tyler gasped, finally beginning to understand that he had made a terrible miscalculation. Marcus smiled then, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of someone who had been holding back for a very long time and was finally allowing his true nature to show through. "I'm exactly what you created, Tyler," Marcus replied. "I'm what happens when you push someone who's been trained to fight back." The silence in the bathroom stretched for what felt like eternity, broken only by Tyler's ragged breathing and the steady drip of water from a leaky pipe. Marcus held the wrestler's wrist with the kind of casual control that spoke of years of practice, years of discipline that Tyler was only now beginning to comprehend. Connor remained frozen against the far wall, his phone forgotten on the grimy floor, while Jake stood motionless by the door, every instinct telling him that moving closer would be a mistake he might not recover from. Tyler's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. The grip on his wrist wasn't just strong, it was precisely applied, targeting pressure points that he didn't even know existed. His fingers had gone completely numb, and a sharp pain was radiating up his arm toward his shoulder. This wasn't the desperate flailing of someone defending themselves for the first time. This was the controlled application of technique by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "Let me go," Tyler managed to say through gritted teeth, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they sounded more like a plea than a demand. Marcus tilted his head slightly, as if considering the request. "You know, Tyler, that's exactly what I wanted you to say to me about 10 minutes ago, when I asked you to just leave me alone. When I tried to explain that I didn't want any trouble." His grip shifted slightly, and Tyler gasped as new pressure points were engaged. "But you didn't want to listen then, did you?" The transformation in Marcus was complete now, and Tyler found himself staring at what felt like an entirely different person. Gone was the quiet, submissive new student who had been willing to scrub toilets to avoid confrontation. In his place stood someone who radiated a calm, controlled confidence that was far more terrifying than any display of rage or aggression would have been. "Where did you learn that?" Tyler asked, his voice strained as he continued to struggle against the unbreakable grip. Marcus's expression remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was remembering things he'd tried very hard to forget. "My grandfather started teaching me when I was 8 years old. Krav Maga first, because he said it was practical, efficient. Then Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because he wanted me to understand leverage and control. By the time I was 12, I was training 6 days a week. By 14, I was competing against adults and winning." Connor swallowed hard, pressing himself further against the wall as if trying to become invisible. This was not the story he'd expected to hear, not the kind of revelation that fit with their carefully constructed image of Marcus as an easy target. "My grandfather was Israeli military," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a distant quality. As he spoke, he'd seen enough violence in his life to understand that sometimes it's the only language that bullies understand. "He taught me that strength isn't about hurting people weaker than you. It's about protecting yourself and others from those who would abuse their power." Tyler tried once more to break free, putting every ounce of his considerable strength into the effort. He was the captain of the wrestling team, after all, and his grip strength was legendary among his teammates. But Marcus's hold remained as solid as steel, And Tyler began to realize that his physical advantages meant nothing against someone with this level of technical skill. "The thing is," Marcus said, as if Tyler wasn't struggling against him at all, "my grandfather also taught me control. He taught me that real strength comes from knowing when not to use your abilities. He made me promise that I would never hurt someone unless I had absolutely no other choice." Jake finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "So why are you doing this? Why aren't you just walking away?" Marcus turned his attention to Jake, and the football player immediately regretted speaking. There was something ancient and cold in Marcus's gaze, something that spoke of battles fought and won in places where mercy was a luxury that couldn't be afforded. "Because walking away only works when the other person lets you," Marcus replied. "And Tyler here has made it very clear that he has no intention of letting me walk away. Haven't you, Tyler?" Tyler's face was red now, partly from exertion, and partly from the growing realization that he had catastrophically misjudged his target. This wasn't supposed to happen. New students were supposed to be intimidated, broken down, and absorbed into the existing social structure. They weren't supposed to reveal themselves as trained fighters with the skills to turn the tables on their tormentors. "Look," Tyler said, his voice taking on a note of desperation that he'd never had to use before. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Maybe I was a little too aggressive in trying to welcome you to the school. We can work this out, right? We can find a way to make this situation better for everyone." Marcus studied Tyler's face with the clinical detachment of someone analyzing an opponent's weaknesses. "That's interesting, Tyler. 5 minutes ago, you were demanding that I put my hands in a toilet bowl to prove my submission. Now you want to work things out. What changed?" The question hung in the air, and Tyler realized that there was no good answer. What had changed was that Marcus had revealed himself to be dangerous, someone who couldn't be easily controlled or intimidated. Tyler's willingness to negotiate wasn't coming from a place of fairness or recognition of wrongdoing. It was coming from fear. "I think," Marcus continued, "that what's really happening here is that you're starting to understand what it feels like to be powerless, to be at someone else's mercy. To realize that all your usual advantages don't mean anything when you're facing someone who operates by different rules." Connor made a small sound of distress, and Marcus glanced in his direction. "Connor, isn't it? The one who's been documenting this whole encounter for posterity." His voice carried a note of mild curiosity, as if he were discussing the weather, rather than a potentially life-changing confrontation. Connor nodded frantically, his face pale with terror. He'd dropped his phone when Marcus had grabbed Tyler, and now it lay on the filthy bathroom floor, its screen cracked from the impact. "Here's what you're going to do, Connor," Marcus said, his tone remaining conversational despite the violence he was clearly capable of inflicting. "You're going to pick up that phone, and you're going to delete every second of video you've recorded in this bathroom. Then you're going to show me the deleted files folder to make sure it's really gone." Connor scrambled to retrieve his phone, his hands shaking so badly that he nearly dropped it twice more before managing to unlock the screen. Tyler watched helplessly as his carefully planned humiliation video was erased, along with any leverage he might have had over Marcus in the future. "Now the deleted files," Marcus prompted, and Connor quickly navigated to the appropriate folder and showed Marcus the empty space where the video had been permanently removed. "Good," Marcus said approvingly. "Now, Jake, I want you to very slowly and carefully move away from that door. No sudden movements, no attempts to be heroic. Just step aside and give me a clear path to leave whenever I decide this conversation is over." Jake complied immediately, pressing himself against the wall and holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. His football conditioning had given him size and strength, but he'd never faced anyone who radiated the kind of controlled lethality that Marcus was displaying. Every instinct told him that challenging this person would end very badly for him. Tyler's desperation was growing by the second. His reputation, his social standing, everything he'd built at Riverside High was crumbling in real time. If word got out that he'd been controlled and humiliated by the new kid, his carefully constructed image of invincibility would be destroyed. Worse than that, if Marcus decided to escalate the situation further, Tyler might be facing physical consequences that he was completely unprepared to handle. "Please," Tyler said, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. "What do you want? How do we fix this?" Marcus's grip on Tyler's wrist shifted again, and the wrestler felt a new wave of pain shoot up his arm. "What I want, Tyler, is very simple. I want to be left alone. I want to attend my classes, do my homework, and graduate, without having to deal with any more of your initiation rituals or power games." Tyler nodded frantically. "Yes, absolutely. No problem. Consider it done." But Marcus wasn't finished. "I also want you to understand something very important about the dynamic that's developing here. You see, up until this moment, you've been operating under the assumption that you held all the power in this relationship. You had the connections, the influence, the physical advantages. You thought that gave you the right to humiliate me, to force me into submission." Tyler tried to speak, but Marcus continued before he could get a word out. "But power isn't really about any of those things, is it, Tyler? Real power comes from being willing and able to do what others can't or won't do. It comes from having skills that others don't possess, and the willingness to use those skills when necessary." The bathroom fell silent again, except for Tyler's labored breathing. Marcus's words were sinking in, and with them came the terrifying realization that everything Tyler thought he knew about social hierarchies and dominance had just been turned upside down. "So here's what's going to happen," Marcus said, his voice taking on a note of finality that made all three of his audience members stand straighter. "You're going to leave me alone. Not just today, not just this week, but for the rest of my time at Riverside High. You're going to make sure that Jake and Connor and anyone else in your little crew understands that I'm off limits." Tyler nodded again, but Marcus wasn't done. "Establishing the new rules of their relationship. More than that," Marcus continued, "you're going to make sure that you don't target any other students the way you were planning to target me. Because if I hear about you forcing anyone else to clean bathrooms, or humiliating them for your entertainment, or using your family connections to avoid consequences for your behavior, then we're going to have another conversation. And I promise you, Tyler, that the next conversation won't be nearly as civilized as this one has been." The threat was delivered in the same calm conversational tone that Marcus had been using throughout the encounter, but its implications were crystal clear. Tyler was being given a choice: reform his behavior entirely or face consequences that he was completely unprepared to handle. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Marcus asked. Tyler's voice came out as barely more than a croak. "Yes, I understand." Marcus studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether the wrestler was being sincere or simply saying what he thought Marcus wanted to hear. After what felt like an eternity, he seemed to reach a decision. "Good," Marcus sighed and suddenly released Tyler's wrist. Tyler stumbled backward, cradling his arm against his chest and flexing his fingers to try to restore circulation. The relief of being free from Marcus's grip was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the realization that the new student had let him go by choice, not because Tyler had fought his way free or found some weakness to exploit. Marcus stepped back and straightened his shirt, checking his appearance in the cracked mirror above the sinks. To anyone who might encounter him in the hallway, he would look like nothing more than a student who had made a quick bathroom stop. Between classes, there was no sign of the controlled violence he'd just displayed, no indication that he'd just completely dominated three students who had expected to make him their victim. "One more thing," Marcus said, turning back to face Tyler and his companions. "I know that right now, you're probably thinking about ways to get revenge for what just happened here. You're probably considering whether your father's position gives you enough protection to retaliate against me without facing consequences." Tyler's face went white. The accuracy of Marcus's assessment was frightening, as if the new student could read his thoughts. "Let me save you some time and effort," Marcus continued. "Retaliation would be a mistake. A very serious mistake. Because what you've seen here today is me being restrained. Me showing you mercy because I gave my family my word that I would try to resolve conflicts peacefully whenever possible." He paused, letting that sink in. "But if you force me to break that promise, if you make it impossible for me to handle this situation with words instead of actions, then you'll discover exactly why my family has had to leave 3 different towns in the past 5 years. And trust me, Tyler, that's not a lesson you want to learn." The bathroom fell silent one final time. Marcus walked toward the door, and Jake scrambled to get out of his way, pressing himself against the wall as if trying to melt into the tiles. As Marcus reached for the door handle, he paused and looked back at the 3 students he was leaving behind. "Oh, and Tyler," he said casually, "you might want to have a doctor look at that wrist. I was very careful not to cause any permanent damage, but you're going to have some bruising and stiffness for the next few days. Consider it a reminder of our conversation." With that, Marcus opened the door and walked out, leaving Tyler, Jake, and Connor alone in the bathroom with the weight of what had just transpired. For several minutes, none of them spoke. They simply stood there, processing the fact that their carefully planned humiliation of the new kid had resulted in their own complete and utter defeat. Tyler flexed his wrist again, wincing at the pain that shot up his arm. The physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological impact of what had just happened. In the span of less than an hour, he'd gone from being the undisputed alpha of Riverside High to being thoroughly dominated by someone he'd dismissed as an easy target. Connor picked up his phone with shaking hands, staring at the cracked screen, as if it could somehow restore the deleted video that had represented their insurance policy against Marcus. But the evidence was gone, and with it, any hope of controlling the narrative about what had happened in this bathroom. Jake remained, pressed against the wall, his mind still reeling from the casual display of skill and control that Marcus had demonstrated. He'd faced plenty of tough opponents on the football field, players who were bigger, stronger, and more aggressive than he was. But he'd never encountered anyone who radiated the kind of quiet, controlled danger that Marcus had shown. It was like the difference between facing a barking dog and encountering a tiger that had decided not to attack you yet. Finally, Tyler found his voice. "We don't talk about this," he said, his words barely audible. "Not to anyone, not ever." Jake and Connor nodded their agreement immediately. The last thing any of them wanted was for word to spread about how they'd been outmaneuvered and dominated by the quiet new kid. Their reputations, their social standing, everything they'd worked to build at Riverside High depended on maintaining the fiction that they were still the ones in control. But as they finally left that bathroom and went their separate ways, each of them carried with them the knowledge that everything had changed. The social order they'd taken for granted, the assumed hierarchy that had placed them at the top of the school's power structure, had been shattered by someone who operated according to rules they didn't understand. Marcus Johnson was no longer the submissive new student they could push around and humiliate for their entertainment. He was something far more dangerous, someone with skills and knowledge that made their usual methods of intimidation useless. And worse than that, he'd made it clear that he was willing to use those skills if pushed too far. As Tyler walked through the hallways of Riverside High, cradling his injured wrist and trying to maintain his usual confident demeanor, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just encountered something that would change everything about his remaining time at the school. The quiet new kid had shown him a glimpse of real power, and Tyler was beginning to understand that all his family connections and social influence meant nothing against someone who was willing and able to meet force. with superior force. The game had changed, and Tyler Brooks was no longer sure he knew how to play it. Word spread through Riverside High with the speed that only teenage gossip could achieve, though the details became increasingly distorted with each retelling. By the time the lunch period arrived, 3 different versions of the bathroom incident were circulating through the hallways, each one more dramatic than the last. Some students claimed that Marcus had hospitalized Tyler with a single punch. Others insisted that the wrestling captain had been found crying in the bathroom, begging for mercy. The truth, as it often did in high school environments, became secondary to the entertainment value of the story. Marcus himself remained blissfully unaware of the rumors swirling around him as he sat in his usual spot near the library entrance, methodically working through a turkey sandwich his mother had packed that morning. He'd returned to his normal routine after leaving the bathroom, attending his remaining classes with the same quiet focus he'd maintained since arriving at Riverside High. To any casual observer, he appeared to be exactly the same unassuming transfer student he'd been that morning, showing no signs of the dramatic confrontation that had taken place just hours earlier. It was Sofia Martinez who first approached him with concrete information about what was happening in the broader school community. Sofia was a junior who wrote for the school newspaper and had developed a reputation for her investigative instincts and willingness to pursue stories that other students avoided. She'd been tracking patterns of bullying and administrative indifference at Riverside for months, building a case that she hoped would eventually see publication in the local community newspaper where her older brother worked as a photographer. Sofia slid into the seat across from Marcus without waiting for an invitation, her dark eyes bright with curiosity and something that might have been respect. She was a small girl with an animated way of speaking that drew people in, and Marcus found himself paying attention despite his general preference for solitude. "So," Sofia said without preamble, "Tyler Brooks apparently had some kind of accident in the bathroom near the old gym this morning. Hurt his wrist pretty badly, from what I hear. Funny thing is, he won't tell anyone how it happened. Just keeps saying he slipped on a wet floor." Marcus continued eating his sandwich, his expression giving away nothing. "Accidents happen," he said mildly. Sofia leaned forward, studying his face with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading between the lines. "They do indeed. Especially when someone's been pushing people around for so long that they forget some people might push back." She paused, then added, "I've been documenting Tyler's behavior for months, Marcus. The way he targets new students, the humiliation rituals, the protection he gets from his family connections. Today's the first time I've ever seen him look genuinely rattled." Marcus set down his sandwich and met Sofia's gaze directly. There was intelligence there, and a moral conviction that reminded him of his grandfather's stories about journalists who risked everything to expose corruption and abuse. "What exactly are you asking me, Sofia?" "I'm asking if you're the reason Tyler Brooks is walking around school looking like he's seen a ghost," she replied bluntly. "And if you are, I'm asking whether you'd be willing to talk to me about what really happened in that bathroom." For a long moment, Marcus considered his options. His instinct was to deflect, to maintain the careful neutrality that had served him well at previous schools. But there was something about Sofia's direct approach, her obvious commitment to holding bullies accountable, that made him reconsider his usual strategy. "Let's say, hypothetically, that Tyler learned something important about the consequences of his behavior," Marcus said carefully. "What would you do with that information?" Sofia's eyes lit up with understanding. "Hypothetically, I'd want to make sure that lesson stuck. I'd want to ensure that other students who've been targeted by Tyler and his crew understand that they have options beyond just accepting abuse." She leaned back in her chair, her expression becoming more serious. "And I'd want to document the changes in his behavior, to see if one moment of accountability might lead to lasting reform." Marcus found himself genuinely impressed by Sofia's approach. She wasn't asking for salacious details or looking to sensationalize what had happened. Instead, she seemed to understand the broader implications of Tyler's apparent change in attitude. And she was interested in monitoring whether it would result in meaningful improvements for other students. Hypothetically, Marcus said with the ghost of a smile, I think that would be a very worthwhile project. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Emma Thompson, a quiet sophomore who had been one of Tyler's frequent targets over the past several months. Emma was small and bookish, with the kind of nervous energy that came from constantly expecting attack. She approached their table hesitantly, as if unsure whether she was welcome. "Excuse me," Emma said softly, addressing Marcus directly. "I heard about what happened with Tyler this morning. I heard different versions of it, anyway. I just wanted to say thank you." Marcus looked puzzled. "Thank you for what?" Emma's eyes filled with tears, though she was clearly fighting to maintain her composure. "For whatever you did. Tyler cornered me in the library yesterday and made me copy his history homework while he filmed it on his phone. He said if I didn't help him cheat, he'd post embarrassing videos of me online." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "But today, he actually apologized to me. He deleted the video right in front of me and said he wouldn't bother me anymore." Sophia and Marcus exchanged a look of surprise. Neither had expected Tyler to take the warnings about changing his behavior so seriously, or to act so quickly to undo previous damage. "He's been going around all morning," Emma continued, "finding people he's messed with and trying to make things right. Jake Morrison returned the lunch money he stole from David Chun last week. Connor Hayes took down some awful posts he made about Jessica Sullivan. It's like they're all suddenly afraid of something." Marcus felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and unease at this news. He'd hoped that his confrontation with Tyler would result in being left alone, but he hadn't anticipated such a dramatic change in the wrestler's treatment of other students. It suggested that Tyler had taken his warnings about protecting others very seriously indeed, perhaps more seriously than Marcus had intended. Sophia was practically vibrating with excitement as she processed this information. "This is incredible," she said, pulling out a notebook and beginning to scribble notes. "If Tyler's actually making amends to his victims, if he's genuinely reforming his behavior, this could be the beginning of a real change in the school culture." Emma lingered by their table, still looking somewhat overwhelmed by the sudden reversal in her circumstances. "I don't really understand what happened," she admitted. "Tyler's been tormenting kids here for years, and his dad always protects him from any real consequences. What could possibly have scared him enough to make him change overnight?" Marcus chose his words carefully. Sometimes people need to understand that their actions have consequences before they're willing to modify their behavior. Maybe Tyler just needed to encounter a situation where his usual advantages didn't protect him. Sophia was watching Marcus closely as he spoke, and he could see her journalist's instincts working to piece together the full picture. She was beginning to understand that whatever had transpired between Marcus and Tyler had been significant enough to fundamentally alter the power dynamic at Riverside High. As Emma thanked them again and moved away, Sophia leaned across the table toward Marcus. "You know, there's something I should probably tell you about Tyler's family situation," she said quietly. "The protection he gets from his father isn't just about athletic department politics. Coach Brooks has been covering up incidents involving Tyler for years, and there are rumors about the family having connections to some pretty unsavory elements in the community." Marcus felt a chill of recognition. This pattern was all too familiar from his previous schools, where bullies often turned out to be protected by networks of adult corruption and influence. "What kind of connections?" Sophia glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then continued in a whisper. "My brother's been investigating some financial irregularities in the school district's construction contracts. Apparently, Coach Brooks has been steering business to certain companies in exchange for kickbacks. The athletic department's budget has been inflated for years to hide the money laundering. The implications of this revelation were staggering. If Tyler's family was indeed involved in corruption beyond just protecting their son's bullying behavior, then Marcus's confrontation with the wrestler might have consequences far beyond what he'd anticipated. Powerful people who felt threatened might respond in ways that went well beyond typical high school retaliation. "Sophia," Marcus said seriously, "if what you're saying is true, then you and your brother need to be very careful about how you pursue this investigation. People who are willing to launder money through school budgets aren't going to hesitate to silence journalists who threaten their operations." Sophia's expression grew more determined rather than frightened. "That's exactly why this story needs to be told. Students like Emma have been suffering while adults who should protect them instead enable their tormentors for financial gain." She met Marcus's eyes directly. "And if Tyler's sudden change in behavior is connected to someone finally standing up to the corruption, then that's a story that needs to be documented and shared." Marcus found himself admiring Sophia's courage, even as he worried about the risks she was taking. She reminded him of his grandfather's stories about resistance, fighters who had refused to be intimidated by seemingly overwhelming odds. But he also understood better than most how quickly situations like this could escalate beyond anyone's control. "Just promise me you'll be smart about it," Marcus said. "Document everything, keep copies in multiple locations, and make sure other people know what you're investigating. People who operate through intimidation rely on their victims being isolated and unsupported." Sophia nodded, but Marcus could see that she was already mentally planning her next steps in the investigation. Her commitment to exposing the truth was admirable, but it also meant that the quiet resolution he'd hoped for was unlikely to remain quiet for very long. The rest of the lunch period passed without further incident, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he'd set something in motion that would be impossible to control. His intention had been simply to establish boundaries with Tyler and ensure his own safety at Riverside High. Instead, he appeared to have triggered a broader reckoning with the school's power structure that could have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. When the afternoon classes began, Marcus noticed immediate changes in the social dynamics around him. Students who had previously avoided eye contact now nodded respectfully when they passed him in the hallways. A few even approached him directly to express gratitude for whatever role he'd played in Tyler's apparent transformation. The attention made him deeply uncomfortable, as it was exactly the kind of visibility he'd spent months trying to avoid. More concerning was the attention he was receiving from the adult staff at Riverside High. During his chemistry class, Marcus caught Mr. Peterson studying him with the kind of analytical interest that suggested word of the morning's events had reached the faculty. When the teacher asked him to stay after class to discuss his lab report, Marcus knew that the conversation would involve topics far beyond scientific methodology. "Marcus," Mr. Peterson began once the other students had left, "I've been hearing some interesting stories about you today. Stories that suggest you might have had a more eventful morning than your academic performance would indicate." Marcus maintained his neutral expression, though internally he was calculating how much the teacher actually knew versus what he was fishing for. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Peterson. I've been focused on my classes and trying to catch up on the curriculum differences between here and my previous school." Mr. Peterson smiled, but it wasn't entirely friendly. "That's commendable, Marcus, but I think we both know that something significant happened between you and Tyler Brooks today. Tyler's been one of our most challenging students for years, and suddenly he's apologizing to people and following school rules. That kind of dramatic behavioral change doesn't happen without a catalyst." The chemistry teacher walked around to the front of his desk and leaned against it, studying Marcus with the intensity of someone conducting an experiment. "The question is whether that catalyst represents a positive development for our school community, or whether it's something we need to be concerned about." Marcus realized that he was being tested, evaluated to determine whether he represented a threat to the existing order at Riverside High. Mr. Peterson's questions weren't coming from curiosity or concern for student welfare. They were coming from adults who had been comfortable with the previous power structure and were unsure about the implications of its disruption. "I think students treating each other with respect is always a positive development," Marcus replied carefully. "If Tyler has decided to change his behavior toward other students, that seems like something to be encouraged rather than questioned." Mr. Peterson nodded slowly, but Marcus could see that the teacher remained skeptical about his innocence in the day's events. Of course, respect and kindness are important values, but so are stability and order. Sometimes when power structures change too quickly, the results can be unpredictable and potentially dangerous. The warning was subtle but unmistakable. The adult staff at Riverside High were prepared to tolerate Tyler's bullying because it represented a known quantity, a manageable form of disruption that could be controlled through his family connections. Marcus's intervention, whatever form it had taken, represented something unknown and therefore potentially threatening to their carefully maintained equilibrium. "I understand," Marcus said, though his tone made it clear that he didn't necessarily agree with the underlying philosophy. "I have no interest in disrupting the school environment. I just want to complete my education here without unnecessary complications." Mr. Peterson studied his face for another long moment, then seemed to reach a decision. "I hope that's true, Marcus. For everyone's sake." He returned to his desk and began organizing papers, a clear signal that the conversation was over. "You can go now. Try to have a peaceful rest of your day." As Marcus left the chemistry classroom, he reflected on how quickly his situation at Riverside High had become complicated. His confrontation with Tyler had been intended to establish simple boundaries, but it was clear that the implications were reverberating throughout the entire school community. Students were celebrating what they saw as the defeat of a long-time tormentor, while adults were concerned about challenges to their authority and the stability of existing power arrangements. The final period of the day was American history with Mrs. Walsh, and Marcus was relieved to find that the teacher seemed more interested in discussing the Industrial Revolution than in analyzing his role in the morning's events. The lesson focused on labor disputes and the sometimes violent conflicts between workers and management, and Marcus found the historical parallels to his current situation both ironic and enlightening. When the dismissal bell rang, Marcus gathered his materials slowly, hoping to avoid the crowds of students who might want to discuss Tyler's transformation or thank him for his alleged role in bringing it about. He'd almost made it to his locker when he encountered Tyler himself, standing alone near the trophy display case that showcased Riverside High's athletic achievements. The wrestler looked different than he had that morning, smaller somehow, as if the confidence that had always defined his presence had been fundamentally shaken. His injured wrist was wrapped in an elastic bandage, and he carried himself with the careful movements of someone who had been reminded of his physical limitations. "Marcus," Tyler said quietly as he approached, "I was hoping I could talk to you for a minute." Marcus stopped but maintained a safe distance, unsure of Tyler's intentions. "What do you want to talk about?" Tyler glanced around to make sure they weren't being observed, then stepped closer. "I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about what you said this morning, about consequences and responsibility and the way I've been treating other students." Marcus waited for him to continue, curious about where this conversation was heading. "The thing is," Tyler said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you were right. I have been using my family's influence to avoid accountability for my actions. I've been hurting people because I could, because I knew nobody would stop me." He paused, flexing his injured wrist unconsciously. "But after what happened today, I realized that there are some forms of accountability that my father can't protect me from." Marcus studied Tyler's expression, trying to determine whether this apparent contrition was genuine or simply another form of manipulation. So what are you planning to do about it? I've already started, Tyler replied. I spent most of the day finding people I've wronged and trying to make amends. I know it doesn't undo the damage I've caused, but I'm hoping it's a start. He met Marcus's eyes directly. I also wanted to ask you something. How did you know about my family's business arrangements? About the things my father has been involved in? Marcus felt a moment of confusion before realizing that Tyler was referring to Sophia's investigation rather than anything Marcus had actually said. Apparently, the wrestler had been doing some research of his own and had discovered the financial irregularities that Sophia's brother had been documenting. I didn't know anything specific, Marcus said honestly. I just recognized the pattern. Bullies who seem untouchable usually have adult protection that goes beyond normal family support. Tyler nodded slowly, as if this explanation made sense to him. Well, you were right about that too. My father's been covering for me because he couldn't afford to have anyone looking too closely at our family's activities. He paused then, added quietly, I think I've been protecting him as much as he's been protecting me. The admission was more honest than Marcus had expected, and it suggested that Tyler's transformation might be more genuine than he'd initially believed. The wrestler was beginning to understand that his behavior hadn't just hurt his victims. It had made him complicit in a broader system of corruption and abuse. What are you going to do with that knowledge? Marcus asked. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the implications of his newfound awareness. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I know I can't keep pretending that none of it is my responsibility. As they stood there in the hallway, Marcus realized that his confrontation with Tyler had accomplished something far more significant than he'd originally intended. He hadn't just stopped a bully. He'd forced someone to confront the broader system that had enabled and protected their harmful behavior. Tyler's transformation might be the beginning of changes that extended far beyond Riverside High's social hierarchy. Tyler, Marcus said finally, if you're serious about making changes, you should know that there are people working to expose the corruption you're talking about. People who could use your cooperation in documenting what's been happening. Tyler's eyes widened with alarm. You mean like investigators? Police? I mean like journalists, Marcus clarified. People who want to tell the truth about how students have been hurt while adults look the other way for financial gain. Tyler considered this for several seconds, and Marcus could see him weighing the potential consequences of cooperation against the moral obligation to help expose the truth. Finally, he nodded slowly. If someone's really trying to help the kids I've hurt, then yeah, I'll talk to them. I'll tell them everything I know. He met Marcus's gaze directly. It's the least I can do. As they parted ways and Marcus finally made it to his locker, he reflected on the unexpected turns his day had taken. He'd woken up that morning hoping simply to avoid attention and complete another anonymous day at Riverside High. Instead, he'd been forced to reveal abilities he'd tried to keep hidden, had triggered a fundamental shift in the school's power dynamics, and had apparently set in motion an investigation that could expose corruption throughout the district. The quiet life he'd been seeking seemed more elusive than ever, but for the first time since arriving at Riverside High, Marcus felt like he might be part of something larger than just his own survival. Sophia's investigation, Tyler's apparent genuine remorse, and the gratitude of students like Emma suggested that his intervention might lead to lasting positive changes for the entire school community. As he walked toward the parking lot where his mother would be waiting to drive him home, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. His grandfather had always taught him that real strength came from protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Today, for the first time in years, Marcus felt like he'd honored that lesson in a way that his grandfather would have been proud of. The transformation was complete, but it wasn't just Tyler who had changed. Marcus Johnson had discovered that sometimes the greatest victories came not from remaining invisible, but from stepping into the light and using your abilities to make the world a little more just. He was no longer just the quiet new kid trying to avoid trouble. He was someone who had proven that bullies could be stopped, that corruption could be exposed, and that sometimes one person's courage could inspire others to stand up for what was right. The future at Riverside High remained uncertain, but for the first time since his family's latest move, Marcus felt genuinely hopeful about what that future might hold. 3 months had passed since the bathroom confrontation that changed everything at Riverside High, and the ripple effects continued to spread far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Marcus Johnson sat in the school newspaper office, reading the latest draft of Sophia Martinez's investigative series that would soon be published in the Millbrook Community Herald. The expose detailed not just the corruption within the school district's construction contracts, but a broader pattern of administrative indifference to student welfare that had allowed bullying to flourish unchecked for years. The office buzzed with activity as Sophia and her team prepared for what they knew would be a bombshell revelation. Bank records had been subpoenaed, district officials had been questioned under oath, and a grand jury was reviewing evidence of systematic fraud that stretched back nearly a decade. Coach Brooks had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, and several other school board members were facing scrutiny for their roles in approving questionable contracts. Marcus had never intended to become the catalyst for such a comprehensive investigation, but his decision to stand up to Tyler had set in motion a chain of events that revealed corruption far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The quiet new student who had simply wanted to be left alone had inadvertently become the spark that ignited a movement for accountability and reform throughout the entire Millbrook school system. Tyler Brooks himself had undergone the most dramatic transformation of anyone involved in the unfolding scandal. The former wrestling captain had not only cooperated fully with investigators, providing detailed testimony about his father's business arrangements and the culture of impunity that had protected him from consequences, but had also become an unexpected advocate for anti-bullying initiatives within the school. His public acknowledgement of the harm he had caused to other students, delivered during a school-wide assembly, had been both shocking and transformative for the entire Riverside High community. The assembly had been Emma Thompson's idea, born from her work with a support group for bullying victims that had formed in the wake of Tyler's public apology campaign. Emma, once one of Tyler's most frequent targets, had emerged as a powerful voice for student rights and had been instrumental in organizing forums where victims could share their experiences and work toward healing. Her courage in speaking publicly about her own experiences had inspired dozens of other students to come forward with their own stories of harassment and intimidation. Marcus watched through the newspaper office window as Emma led a group of underclassmen through the courtyard, pointing out the new anti-bullying posters that had been installed throughout the campus. The transformation in her confidence and leadership abilities was remarkable to witness. The nervous, frightened girl who had thanked him tearfully in the cafeteria had evolved into someone who commanded respect and attention through her advocacy work. Her voice carried clearly through the glass as she explained to the younger students the new reporting procedures and support systems that had been implemented to protect them from harassment. Sophia looked up from her computer screen, where she was making final edits to her article. "The Herald editor called this morning," she said, her eyes bright with excitement and nervous energy. "They're planning to run this as a front-page story tomorrow, and they think it might get picked up by the state newspapers. The implications go way beyond just our district." Marcus nodded, though he felt a familiar mixture of pride and anxiety about the attention the story would bring. His role in triggering the investigation had been kept deliberately vague in Sophia's reporting, described only as student resistance to systemic bullying, rather than any specific details about what had transpired in that bathroom. But he knew that people in Millbrook were beginning to piece together the timeline, and his carefully maintained anonymity was becoming harder to preserve. The door to the newspaper office opened, and Mr. Chun entered carrying a stack of printed Photographs. The pay teacher had become an unexpected ally in the reform movement, using his position to document the positive changes occurring throughout the school and advocate for expanded mental health resources for students. His presence in the office represented one of the most significant shifts in the adult culture at Riverside High, where teachers were finally beginning to take active roles in protecting students rather than simply maintaining order. The photos from yesterday's peer mediation training are ready, Mr. Chen announced, spreading the pictures across Sophia's desk. I think these really capture how much the school culture has evolved over the past few months. Marcus studied the images, which showed students from different social groups working together to learn conflict resolution techniques. In one photo, Jake Morrison was listening intently as a former victim of his bullying explained how his actions had affected her academic performance and mental health. In another, Connor Hayes was demonstrating to younger students how to document harassment incidents and report them through the new anonymous system that had been implemented. The transformation of Tyler's former crew had been almost as dramatic as Tyler's own change. Jake had thrown himself into community service work, volunteering at a local youth center and using his athletic skills to mentor at-risk kids from the elementary schools. Connor had become a passionate advocate for digital citizenship, speaking to classes about the dangers of cyberbullying and the importance of using technology responsibly. Both had testified before the school board about the toxic culture they had helped perpetuate and their commitment to ensuring it never returned. The State Education Department wants to use our peer mediation program as a model for other districts, Mr. Chung continued, his voice filled with pride. They're sending observers next week to document our procedures and interview students about their experiences. Sophia beamed at this news, clearly thrilled that their efforts were being recognized on such a broad scale. That's incredible. 6 months ago, this place was like a war zone for anyone who didn't fit into the right social groups. Now we're becoming a model for how schools should handle bullying and student support. Marcus found himself thinking about his grandfather, who had always taught him that the greatest victories were those that created lasting positive change for many people rather than just solving immediate problems for a few. The old man would have been proud to see how a single moment of standing up to injustice had grown into a comprehensive transformation of an entire community's approach to student welfare and institutional accountability. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door, and Principal Patterson entered with the expression that mixed relief with exhaustion. The past 3 months had been challenging for the administrator, who had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the culture that had developed under her leadership while simultaneously implementing sweeping reforms to prevent future incidents. I wanted to personally thank you all for your work on this investigation, Principal Patterson said, addressing the room but looking directly at Sophia. I know it hasn't been easy to expose these problems, and I want you to know that. Your courage in pursuing the truth has made our school safer for everyone. Sophia accepted the praise graciously, though Marcus could see that she remained focused on the broader implications of their discoveries. We're just glad that the truth is finally coming out, she replied. Students deserve to learn in an environment where they're protected and supported, not one where they have to fear retaliation for speaking up about abuse. Principal Patterson nodded solemnly. The board has approved funding for 3 new counseling positions and a full-time student advocate who will work exclusively on harassment and bullying prevention. We're also implementing mandatory training for all staff on recognizing and responding to student welfare concerns. Marcus was impressed by the scope of the reforms being implemented, though he couldn't help but wonder whether these changes would have occurred without the external pressure of the corruption investigation. It was a sobering reminder that institutional change often required public scrutiny and accountability measures to ensure it was both genuine and lasting. There's something else, Principal Patterson continued, turning to address Marcus directly for the first time. The district has asked me to extend a formal apology to you for the treatment you received here during your first weeks. While I understand you prefer to keep a low profile, I want you to know that your actions have made a difference for hundreds of students who will attend Riverside High in the future. Marcus felt uncomfortable being singled out for recognition, but he understood that Principal Patterson was trying to acknowledge his role in triggering the broader transformation. "I appreciate that," he said quietly, "but this was never about me personally. It was about making sure that all students can feel safe at school." The principal smiled at his response, clearly recognizing the maturity and wisdom in his perspective. "That attitude is exactly why the changes we've made will be sustainable. This wasn't about personal revenge or individual conflict resolution. It was about addressing systemic problems that had been allowed to persist for too long." As Principal Patterson left the office to attend another meeting related to the ongoing investigation, Marcus reflected on how profoundly his life had changed since that morning when Tyler had cornered him in the bathroom. He had come to Riverside High hoping to maintain the same low profile that had served him at previous schools, but circumstances had forced him to make choices that put him at the center of a much larger story about justice, accountability, and institutional reform. The irony was not lost on him that his attempt to avoid attention had ultimately made him a central figure in one of the most significant investigations in Millbrook's recent history. But unlike his previous experiences with violence and its consequences, this time the aftermath had been overwhelmingly positive. Rather than being forced to leave town in disgrace, Marcus found himself part of a community that was actively working to become better, more just and more protective of its most vulnerable members. Sophia was putting the finishing touches on her article when her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen, and her eyes widened with excitement. "The FBI field office in Portland wants to interview Tyler tomorrow," she announced. "Apparently, the financial irregularities we uncovered are connected to a broader federal investigation into construction fraud in rural school districts." Marcus felt a chill of recognition at this news. His grandfather had often warned him that corruption was rarely isolated to single individuals or institutions, but instead tended to be part of larger networks that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. The revelation that Tyler's father's activities were connected to federal crimes suggested that the impact of their investigation would extend far beyond Millbrook. "Does Tyler know?" Marcus asked, concerned about how the wrestler would handle the pressure of federal scrutiny. Sophia nodded. "I called him as soon as I got the message. He says he's ready to tell them everything he knows. He seems to understand that this is bigger than just his father's career or his family's reputation." Marcus was genuinely impressed by Tyler's continued commitment to accountability, even as the stakes continued to rise. The transformation from entitled bully to cooperative witness in a federal investigation represented a level of personal growth that few people achieved under any circumstances, let alone in the span of a few months. Emma Thompson appeared in the doorway of the newspaper office, her arms loaded with petition signatures and survey responses from the latest student welfare assessment. Her work coordinating victim support services had evolved into a comprehensive advocacy program that was being studied by education researchers from several universities. "We just hit 500 signatures on the petition for mandatory bystander intervention training," Emma announced, clearly thrilled by the response. "And the survey results show that 93% of students now feel comfortable reporting harassment incidents, compared to less than 20% at the beginning of the school year." The statistics were remarkable, representing a fundamental shift in school culture that went far beyond just the elimination of Tyler's particular brand of bullying. Students were now actively engaged in protecting each other and holding their peers accountable for harmful behavior, creating a self-reinforcing system of mutual support and collective responsibility. Marcus watched Emma organize her materials with the efficiency of someone who had discovered a true calling in advocacy work. Her transformation had been just as dramatic as Tyler's, though in the opposite direction. Where Tyler had moved from aggressor to reformed advocate, Emma had evolved from victim to empowered leader. Both changes demonstrated the potential for people to fundamentally reshape their roles and identities when given the support and opportunity to do so. The university researchers want to interview you about the peer support programs you've developed, Sophia told Emma. They think your model could be implemented in schools across the region. Emma blushed with pride, but maintained her focus on the practical implications. That's wonderful, but I want to make sure we're not just creating feel-good programs that don't actually protect students. Real change requires ongoing commitment and accountability, not just good intentions. Her words resonated deeply with Marcus, who had seen too many reform efforts fail because they focused on superficial changes rather than addressing underlying power structures and cultural norms. Emma's insistence on measurable outcomes and sustained accountability suggested that the improvements at Riverside High might indeed prove to be lasting rather than temporary. The afternoon was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway outside the newspaper office. Through the window, Marcus could see students gathering around someone who appeared to be speaking passionately about something. Sophia immediately grabbed her recorder and headed toward the door, her journalistic instincts activated by the possibility of a newsworthy event. When they emerged from the office, they discovered that the speaker was Tyler Brooks himself, addressing a group of middle school students who were visiting Riverside High as part of a transition program. Tyler was explaining to them the importance of treating their peers with respect and dignity, using his own experiences as a cautionary tale about the consequences of bullying behavior. I spent years thinking that my family's influence made me untouchable, Tyler was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the hallway. I hurt people because I could, because I thought there would never be any real consequences for my actions. But I learned that there are some forms of accountability that no amount of money or influence can protect you from. Marcus found himself genuinely moved by Tyler's words, which carried a sincerity and depth of understanding that would have been impossible to fake. The wrestler was sharing not just the facts of his transformation, but the emotional and moral journey that had led him to fundamentally reconsider his values and priorities. One of the middle school students raised her hand with the question, "What made you decide to change? What was the thing that finally made you realize you were wrong?" Tyler paused for a long moment, and Marcus could see him considering how to answer honestly without revealing details that might compromise the ongoing investigation or violate Marcus's privacy. "Someone showed me that real strength isn't about dominating people who are weaker than you," Tyler replied finally. "Real strength is about protecting people who need protection and standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous. I had to learn that lesson the hard way, but I'm grateful that I learned it before it was too late to make things right." The middle school students listened intently, clearly impressed by Tyler's honesty and vulnerability. Several of them asked follow-up questions about bullying prevention and conflict resolution, and Tyler answered each one thoughtfully, drawing on his experiences as both perpetrator and reformed advocate. Marcus realized that Tyler's presentation represented yet another ripple effect from their bathroom confrontation. The wrestler wasn't just making amends to his direct victims. He was actively working to prevent future students from making the same mistakes he had made. His willingness to be vulnerable and honest about his past behavior was creating educational opportunities that could protect countless students in the years to come. As the middle school group moved on to their next activity, Tyler approached Marcus with an expression of nervous determination. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked quietly. They walked to a quieter section of the hallway, away from the bustle of students and staff moving between classes. Tyler seemed to be struggling with how to begin the conversation, and Marcus waited patiently for him to find his words. "I wanted you to know that the FBI interview went well," Tyler said finally. "I told them everything I could remember about My father's business arrangements and the people he worked with. The agent said my testimony could be crucial in prosecuting a network of contractors who've been defrauding school districts across 3 states. Marcus nodded, though he felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern about the expanding scope of the investigation. How are you handling all the pressure? This has to be incredibly difficult for your family. Tyler's expression grew somber. It is difficult, but it's also necessary. I'm finally understanding what you meant that day in the bathroom about consequences and accountability. My father spent years protecting me from the results of my actions, but he was also using me as cover for his own criminal behavior. We were both living in a system that was fundamentally wrong. The insight demonstrated a level of moral clarity that Marcus found genuinely impressive. Tyler had moved beyond simply acknowledging his own wrongdoing to understanding the broader systems of corruption and abuse that had enabled and protected his behavior. The hardest part, Tyler continued, is knowing that if I hadn't encountered someone like you, someone who couldn't be intimidated or controlled, I might have continued hurting people indefinitely. I might never have questioned whether what I was doing was right. Marcus felt a familiar discomfort with being credited as the sole catalyst for Tyler's transformation, but he understood that the wrestler needed to process his experiences in a way that made sense of the dramatic changes in his life. You made the choice to change, Marcus replied. I might have created the circumstances that forced you to confront your behavior, but the decision to become a better person was yours alone. Tyler smiled gratefully at this response. Maybe, but I don't think I would have made that choice without being forced to see myself clearly for the first time. Sometimes people need an external shock to break through their own denial and self-justification. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Coach Williams, the interim athletic director who had been brought in to replace Tyler's father. Coach Williams was a veteran educator known for his commitment to character development and academic excellence, and his appointment had been widely praised by students, parents, and faculty. Tyler, Coach Williams said warmly, I wanted to let you know that the wrestling team has voted unanimously to retire your jersey number in recognition of your courage in coming forward with the truth about the corruption in the athletic department. Tyler looked stunned by this news, clearly not having expected any form of recognition from his former teammates. I don't deserve that, he said quietly. I was part of the problem for so long. Coach Williams shook his head firmly. Character isn't about never making mistakes, Tyler. It's about having the courage to admit when you're wrong and the determination to make things right. Your testimony is going to help clean up a system that was hurting student athletes across the region. That takes real courage. Marcus watched. Tyler processed this unexpected honor, seeing both pride and humility in his expression. The gesture from his former teammates represented a form of redemption that Tyler clearly hadn't expected to receive, and it seemed to reinforce his commitment to continuing his advocacy work. As Coach Williams moved on and Tyler returned to his next class, Marcus reflected on the complex journey that had brought them all to this point. What had begun as a simple confrontation between a bully and his intended victim had evolved into a comprehensive examination of institutional corruption and a model for sustainable reform that was attracting national attention. The quiet new student who had just wanted to be left alone had inadvertently become the catalyst for changes that would affect thousands of students across multiple school districts. His grandfather's lessons about using strength to protect others had proven prophetic in ways that neither of them could have anticipated. Sophia appeared at his side, her notebook filled with quotes and observations from Tyler's presentation to the middle school students. I keep thinking about how different things might have been if you had just stayed quiet that day, she said thoughtfully. If you had accepted the humiliation and tried to blend in like you wanted to. Marcus considered her words carefully. I think about that too, he admitted. But I also think about what my grandfather used to say about inflection points in history. Sometimes individual actions have consequences far beyond what anyone could predict or intend. Sophia nodded, understanding the deeper philosophical implications of what he was saying. Your decision to stand up to Tyler wasn't just about protecting yourself. It was about challenging a system that had been harming students for years, while adults looked the other way. As the school day drew to a close, Marcus made his way to his locker for the final time as a student at Riverside High. His family would be moving again at the end of the semester, this time because his father had received a promotion that would take them to a corporate headquarters in another state. But unlike his previous departures from schools, this one felt more like a graduation than an escape. The hallways that had once felt hostile and unwelcoming now buzzed with positive energy and mutual respect. Students who had once cowered in fear of harassment now walked with confidence, knowing that their concerns would be heard and addressed. Teachers who had once turned a blind eye to obvious problems now actively engaged in protection and advocacy for their students. Emma Thompson was waiting by his locker, holding a card signed by dozens of students whose lives had been improved by the changes that followed his confrontation with Tyler. "We wanted you to know that what you did here mattered," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave all of us permission to believe that things could be different." Marcus accepted the card gratefully, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. Inside were messages from students he'd never spoken to directly, thanking him for his role in creating a safer and more just school environment. The impact of his actions had clearly extended far beyond the immediate circle of Tyler's victims, to include anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of institutional indifference. As he walked toward the parking lot where his mother was waiting to drive him home, Marcus encountered Tyler one final time. The former wrestler was posting flyers for a summer program that would bring together students from different schools to train as peer advocates and conflict resolution specialists. "I hope we stay in touch," Tyler said, extending his hand for a handshake. "I'd like to know how your advocacy work develops at your new school." Marcus shook Tyler's hand, noting the firm grip and steady eye contact that spoke to genuine respect and friendship. "I hope your program is successful," he replied. "The work you're doing could prevent a lot of suffering for future students." Tyler smiled, and for the first time since Marcus had known him, the expression seemed completely genuine and free of any ulterior motives. "We'll see. But I've learned that real change takes time and sustained effort. This is just the beginning." As Marcus walked away from Riverside High for the last time, he reflected on the truth of Tyler's words. Real change did indeed take time and sustained effort, but it also required individuals willing to take risks and stand up for what was right when the moment demanded it. His grandfather had been right about the importance of using strength to protect others, but Marcus was only now beginning to understand the full implications of that lesson. The quiet new student who had desperately wanted to remain invisible had discovered that sometimes the greatest gift you could give to a community was to step into the light and use your abilities to make the world more just. His transformation was complete, but it wasn't an ending so much as a beginning of a lifetime commitment to standing up for those who needed protection and challenging systems that perpetuated harm. The future remained uncertain, but Marcus Johnson was no longer afraid of whatever challenges it might bring. He had learned that courage wasn't about never being scared, but about acting in spite of fear when the situation demanded it. And he had discovered that sometimes one person's willingness to say no to injustice could inspire a movement that changed everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.